Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Jonathan, or Professor Standing. Um, I am one of the co-associate chairs of animation. Um, I've been at SCAD for 5 years. It feels like way longer than that, which is kind of bizarre, but it's only been 5 years, but it feels like I've been here forever. Um, some of you will be animation majors, maybe who've not met me, because I don't teach that many classes anymore, and some of you maybe are not animation majors. But for those of you who I've not met, um, the way I ended up at SCAD was through kind of like a circuitous sequence of events. SCAD was looking to hire somebody with a concept art background, and also ideally somebody with a master's degree. Turns out there are not that many people who fulfill those two criteria in the world. I'm one of them, and so that's kind of how I ended up here. Claire was in my class a couple of quarters ago, um, and we got talking, and I didn't even realize that SCAD had a concept art club. So, hi everybody. I'm sorry that I'm kind of showing up kind of late to the party. I didn't know that this existed, and if I had known, I would have tried to sort of make myself a part of it earlier. But anyway, I'm here now and happy to be here. And when Claire was talking about kind of like what you guys do and the guest speakers that you bring in, most of those guest speakers are much more exciting and much more kind of glamorous than I am. But I figured it was probably worth me throwing my hat in the ring and kind of like offering to do a little kind of um, sort of talk presentation, um, just to kind of like tell you my story. Because even though my story is probably not as exciting as some of the other people who you bring in to kind of make a presentation, in some ways I feel like it might be useful for some of you and give you some encouragement, because not everybody who is a concept artist kind of gets there kind of the same way. And the way I ended up there was kind of like really, really a little kind of unusual. Um, so I was trying to think of a sort of a topic to talk about. And so the theme for what I want to talk to you all about tonight is the idea that if I can do it, you can do it. Because sometimes, I'm sure you would all agree, when we go on the internet and we look at like ArtStation, or God forbid you go to goodbrush.com, which is the website of a painter called Craig Mullins. Hopefully you're all familiar with his work. If anyone hasn't been to his website before, just take a deep breath before you check in on Craig, because he's really amazing. And so there's a tendency when we go on the internet and we look at all this amazing work to say, oh my God, these people are like gods and I'm a mere mortal. How am I ever going to actually do this as a career? And that kind of idea, that sort of intimidating nature of what we see on the internet, it can be one of the biggest impediments to us actually kind of like finding our way into kind of like doing this as a career. So I very much felt that way when I was kind of like coming up and finding my way into this. But what I want to kind of try and demonstrate to all of you by kind of telling you my story is that the pathway to this is not always linear, and much of it really doesn't revolve necessarily kind of around skill. That's always really important. But a lot of it really revolves around being kind of a nice person. That's probably the most important thing to kind of like cultivate as a future concept artist. All right, I am gonna try to show you my screen, and I'm gonna try and make it so that I can still see Zoom. Let's see if I can make this work. No, I can't make this work. All right, this is going to look terrible. I'm just going to have to scrub through the slides with some of the PowerPoint UI, but I can't figure out. I'm on my laptop here. I can't figure out how to do this. So, all right, let me know, everybody, if you can see PowerPoint. Yay! All right, awesome. Okay, so forgive me, everybody. I put the SCAD logo in there because this is still a SCAD sanctioned event, so I gotta sort of do right by my employees. All right, so I mentioned this idea. If I can do it, so can you. All right, and I'm going to try and demonstrate to you what I mean by that. So if you will, come back in time with me, everybody, to 1996. I don't think any of you have your microphones turned on, so I'm not going to wait for an answer, but I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that none of you were alive in 1996, which is totally fine. So let me tell you that in 1996, Oasis were the coolest people in the world. They are now old men, and you might be familiar with their activity because they are doing a tour, allegedly, if they can not kill each other. Oh, Derek. All right, Derek was alive in 1996, but with the exception of Derek, this is Oasis, everybody. Um, uh, Somebody else who looked a little bit different in 1996 was me. Um, I had a buzz cut and I was really thin. Um, and I wore bright red Converse All Star sneakers. That was my kind of like call to fame. I also wore a baseball cap a lot. So there's an irony here. When I went to university, my nickname was actually American John. But it was only because I wore a Detroit Tigers baseball cap and nobody knew what that was. Anyway, when I was thinking about the slideshow earlier today, I was going to make a cartoon of myself at every kind of like stage of my working life, and those cartoons were going to get progressively fatter. I'm telling you this now because this is the only cartoon that I made it to, because just the whole crap ton of stuff fell on my lap today. Didn't get the opportunity to do it, so please forgive me. All right, so in 1996, I graduated from high school and I went to this place. I went to University College Durham, which is in the north of England. And if you're looking at it and you're like, that looks like a castle, that's because it was. I lived in a castle for a year, very drafty. Inside that castle, we had a great hall where we would kind of eat dinner, and they would make sort of formal presentations to us, and sometimes the choir would come in and sing to us. They'd sing arias in Latin before we sat down to eat dinner. If this looks like Hogwarts, there's a good reason for that, because about 15% of the first Harry Potter movie was filmed here. And so I know Americans like to meet English people and be like, oh, did you go to school in Hogwarts? I kind of did, just for one year. But I was doing archaeology and ancient history because that's what my parents wanted me to do. But what I really wanted to do was I wanted to be a concept artist, but I didn't even know what that was. I had a book which some of you will probably be familiar with. It's called The Art of Star Wars, and it was from the original movie from 1977. And I was like, I want to do that. I don't know what that is or where you do it. I assumed California correctly. Um, and part of the issue with growing up in the north of England when I did is nobody could tell me what that was, or if it was actually a job, or where anybody did it, or how you went about it. So I went to university to do archaeology because my parents wanted me to. I lasted one year, didn't get to dig any holes, which was total bullshit. Didn't get to punch any Nazis. So Indiana Jones was like lying the whole time. That's not what it's like to be an archaeologist. So I transferred. I left Durham and I went to the University of Northumbria in Newcastle. And if the preceding two images and this image look different, they really were. I went from this like idyllic, beautiful university where I was really happy to this horrible university where I was utterly miserable. And because nobody could really tell me sort of how to navigate what it is that I wanted to do, I ended up doing fine art there with a capital F. Is anybody in the room? Anybody on the Zoom call? Anyone a fine art student? I don't want to offend anybody. No? Okay. I don't know what fine art at SCAD is like, but I can tell you what fine art was like here. We didn't have classes. They gave us a studio space and they said, make whatever you want, but just so you know, painting is dead, so don't learn to paint, do something else. And then they just kind of went off and chain smoked cigarettes. So for any of you who, when you go to class and you're like, oh, this class isn't very good, you know, I'm not enjoying my time here at SCAD. Just be glad that you're not going here. Anyway, I go here, I do fine art. I don't have a great time and I learn nothing. So during that time when I was at Northumbria, I was so miserable. I was like, I'm getting out of here. So I went to school in America for a year. And I went to a place called Montclair State University, which is in New Jersey. I don't know if any of you from New Jersey. It's not exactly a bastion of learning either, but I had a great time. And after I went to school there, I went to work in Canada for the summer. And I met somebody there, as these things happen. And that person who I met is my wife. And we've been married for 24 years, which is quite a long time. So with no knowledge, no idea what it is that I wanted to do, I decided I was going to emigrate because, you know, why not? So I moved to Toronto. Oh, wait a second. Sorry, that's the wrong slide, everybody. That isn't actually Toronto, even though I know some of you think that that's what Canada looks like. In fairness to you, quite a bit of Canada does look like that, but the part I moved to looked like this. If this image looks low res, it's because it is, because that's what Toronto looked like in 1999 when I moved there. It does not look like that now because so much stuff has been built subsequently. So my wife and I we moved in together. We get a little apartment, and we live in this neighborhood. It's called Parkdale. And if you go there now, this whole street is just kind of like Starbucks and like Gucci and like it's really gentrified. But when we lived there, it was mostly drug dealers and prostitutes and just a very colorful neighborhood that was very cheap to live in. And because it was so cheap, this company were headquartered there. They had this really big building at the end of our street. So some of you will have heard this story before. So those of you who've heard this story before, you can take a nap. Um, my wife and I, we used to walk around the neighborhood a lot because we didn't have a lot of money and we didn't have anything else to do. And we used to walk past this building and I'd see in through the window, they had all these like cardboard cutouts of animated characters that the company had worked on. So for anyone who's not familiar with Nelvana, they made the original Magic School Bus, I think. They made those terrible Star Wars cartoons from the 80s that are on Disney Plus, Ewoks and Droids, Pippi Longstocking. I think they might have even worked on Arthur when Arthur kind of like first started. So they were one of Canada's biggest animation studios. And it just so happened that one of my wife's friends worked there. He had a job pretty high up as director of music. And she asked him, "Can you get my boyfriend at the time an interview?" And he did. And I went into that interview, and for anyone who's interested in this story, you can come and ask me about it later. I'll just give you the short version. It was the most spectacular failure of my working life. I had no idea what I was going in for, what I was asking for. I didn't know anything about animation. And to say that I pooped the bed would be a massive understatement. It was really, really bad. So I was completely discouraged. Needless to say, I didn't get a job. And I didn't reapply and I didn't learn anything from that interview, which was a huge mistake. So I got a job doing something else. I got a job making t-shirts. I worked for a company called the Incredible Clothing Company. Was it incredible? No. It was bloody awful. It was way up in the north end of Toronto, and it was a terrible job. Didn't really pay. But in that interview, I had the good sense to lie. I had learned something from the Nelvana interview. When they asked me, "How is your Photoshop skill level? Is it good?" And I said, "Yeah, it's great. I know all about Photoshop." I didn't know anything about Photoshop. I didn't know what layers were. I didn't know what a custom brush was. I didn't know anything. So I lied to get in the door. And the first 2 days that I worked at this place were pretty terrifying because I was worried that somebody was going to come into my cubicle and be like, "Well, he doesn't know what he's doing." Somehow I managed to survive and I parlayed that into working here. This was the corporate headquarters for Sears in Canada. Um, and when I tell you that I used to call this building the Gulag, you can probably see why. It was not a happy time. It was awful, frankly. But it paid pretty well. I bought my first house when I worked here. So they weren't paying me nothing. But as jobs went, it was really depressing. And so I was sitting there and I was thinking about my interview at Nelvana, and I was like, I've made a mistake here. I kind of screwed this up. I don't know how I went wrong. I need to go back to what it was I was trying to do before. So I was like, well, I don't really know what a concept artist is, but I know what an illustrator is. So I started picking up illustration gigs. So this is my first ever. I don't know why it's in Russian. Don't ask me. I don't have any of these files anymore. I pulled this off the internet. My first ever professional client, like for real, was Games Workshop. I went into a Games Workshop and they had, because I used to play Warhammer when I was a kid. I'd not been in one for years, and my wife and I we went into the one in Toronto, and they had all these comic books on the wall, and I was like, "Oh, I didn't know they made comics." So I'm flipping through one, and I'm like, "Wow, the art in here is terrible. I can do better than this." And I think my wife said to me, like, "Well, then you should try and do that." So I made 3 pages as a sample, and I sent it into Games Workshop. And this is like back in the day when you would send stuff in the post. So I sent them a paper copy of this. And then about 3 days later, I guess after it arrived, I get an email, and it's from an art director at Games Workshop who said, "Oh, you timed this perfectly. I just lost my artist. I need 8 pages of Space Marines, kind of doing Space Marine stuff." And I was like, "Great, I can do that." Never made a comic before, but I was like, "I can figure this out." So I made this comic in a program called Corel Painter, which had no layers, no transparency. I think it had undo, but it had a limit of like 20 undos, I think, or something like that. And also it would crash about every like 25 to 30 minutes. So it was not great, but I shipped the comic and I got a paycheck. And the paycheck was, considering it was only 8 pages of comic, the paycheck was massive. Um, and up until this point, we didn't really have any sort of like real furniture. And we went out and bought like a real bed and a real couch and a bunch of stuff. And my wife was like, well, why don't you do this more? This is pretty good. And I was like, sure, I will. So I ended up working for most of the kind of like role-playing game companies that were operating at the time. I pulled this off the internet too. I worked on the Game of Thrones trading card game years before it became a TV show. That's what I thought Arya Stark to look like. I did a card of Eddard Stark beheading somebody, and I thought Eddard was the bad guy. And so he had this big like grin on his face as he's about to chop the guy's head off. Obviously, I'd not read the book, and they called me on it, so I had to read the book. Anyway, I worked for this was a company called Fantasy Flight Games. I worked for them. Wizards of the Coast, who you'll all be familiar with because they made Dungeons and Dragons. I worked for them, and I did a whole bunch of these jobs, and I started to make some nice money on the side, which was great. And I started to build my portfolio. And because I didn't really know what should go into a portfolio, so working on these jobs, it just really helped kind of like bolster it. And then I met these two guys at like a convention or something where I was trying to like advertise myself as an illustrator. And at first, I thought they were just kind of like two lunatics, and they were like, "Oh, we're making a role-playing game, and we have like a venture capital company is funding us." And I was like, "Why? Why would a venture capital company fund a role-playing game? That makes no sense." Anyway, somehow these guys had got like tens of thousands of dollars, and they were like, "We want to employ you full time as an illustrator." And I was like, "Great, that's awesome." But I was a little scared that they maybe weren't for real. So I kept my job at Sears and I worked for them full time at night. So this was my working day. I used to get up at, I don't know, 5 o'clock in the morning. I'd take the subway to Sears. I'd work half a day until it was my lunch break. I'd take the subway home. I'd run upstairs to my little home office and I'd jump on, I think it was Skype. This was pre-Zoom. And I'd meet with these guys and I'd show them what I made the night before. And I'd be like, hey, look what I did yesterday, meaning last night. And they'd say, yes, no, maybe so, what have you. We'd have a meeting. I'd jump off Skype, get back on the subway, go back to Sears, work the rest of a working day, and then come home at night, have a sandwich or something for dinner, and then begin work on my other job. If that sounds miserable, it was. I made unbelievable money, but I nearly killed myself doing it. But the reason why I'm telling you this is because sometimes the pathway to becoming a concept artist has periods of unbelievable difficulty. And there is a temptation. I was very tempted during this period of time to just kind of throw my hands in the air and say, I can't do this. This is just too hard. It's just not worth it. And there's no shame in that. Not everybody's kind of cut out for working that way. But if you really want to pursue this and you're in kind of like a period of difficulty where you're having to work way harder than you ever thought you were going to have to, I'm going to encourage you to stick with it because, yeah, sometimes it's awful, but sometimes it's totally worth it. So eventually, this is really the only job I've ever been let go from. Eventually, we had a meeting. This is as I'm going along week after week, I'm getting progressively more exhausted. And I went for one of my Skype meetings at lunch with these guys, and they were like, hey, listen, the art, it's not as good as it used to be. Like, what's going on? And I couldn't tell them what it was I was doing. So I had to quit, but I think they were going to let me go anyway. So I quit. But around that time, I applied for a job here. So this was when kind of like the gaming industry in Ontario was starting to grow. So I applied for a job at Silicon Knights, and basically the portfolio I sent them was everything that I'd made for these guys on the role-playing game. Didn't think I'd hear from these guys, and amazingly, they called me for an interview. That interview was on my 30th birthday, which sounds ludicrous, but it's true. Everybody in the room, except for the head of human resources, and I think maybe the art director, everybody in the room was younger than me. And I was like, oh my God, it's too late. I've missed my window. I'm too old. There's no way they're going to give me a job. If you ever find yourself in that situation and you say, I've missed it, I'm too old, all these people are younger than me, it doesn't matter. We all kind of like start our careers or kind of our careers get going at different stages in our lives and different ages. And there's no shame if it starts a little bit later for you than everybody else. But I can tell you what, it was a humbling moment being in that meeting. Here's a weird thing. Has anyone seen the movie Jerry Maguire? I don't know if that really resonates with your generation, but it's a pretty famous movie. And there's a scene in it where Tom Cruise like signs a client, and it's like a turning point in the story. And he's driving away from the meeting, and he puts on the radio, and "Free Falling" by Tom Petty came on. So as I was driving away from that interview, and I knew I'd nailed the interview, I turned on the radio. It wasn't "Free Falling," but it was Tom Petty. It was a different song. "Running Down a Dream," I think was the name of the song. And I swear to God, I drove down the highway with all my windows wound down, singing at the top of my lungs because this was like, I just couldn't believe that I'd actually kind of like arrived. Somebody had actually hired me to be a real concept artist on like real games. Um, was it painful to get there? Hell yes, it was. But that sense of catharsis when I got there was unbelievable. They also doubled my salary relative to what I was making at Sears. So it was a nice day to kind of like go home and tell my wife that all of a sudden my paycheck had increased twofold, which was super nice. So when I went to Silicon Knights, I was originally hired to work on this game. If anybody has an Xbox One, you can grab this for free from the Xbox store. But I would encourage you not to because it isn't good. But Microsoft spent a lot of money on it. And some of that money went to me, which was amazing. And I got to design weapons and armor and like alien robot goblins and all kinds of crap on this game, which is really, really fun. I worked on multiple games there. This was for a game called The Box, which was being made by Sega. Sega ended up canceling the game because basically we couldn't get it to work. It was meant to be like an open world horror game, and as a company, we were not ready to make an open world game. Our engine didn't work, our programs sucked, our game design was terrible. So we had lots of like nice character models and stuff, but the actual game itself was awful. Um, I then worked on a game called Sandman. That was the working title. Obviously, we couldn't launch a game called that, but it was like a Blade Runner meets like John Wick meets, I don't know, something else. This was really fun to work on. It was really in my wheelhouse in terms of kind of aesthetic and ideas. And I did all these like creature designs of creatures that were meant to pass as kind of like people if you weren't really looking, but then they would kind of like jump out and like surprise you and be like, ah, I'm actually a creature. Um, and this was like when I really started to kind of like figure out what our direction was. So we were trying to design like a future police force, and we were making all this generic crap. It was just really, really bad. And somebody was like, "Well, we need a visual direction," and I was like, "All right, let's take seabirds." I was like, "Let's take the color and like the color scheme and kind of like the color proportions of like seagulls." And yeah, it does look like a Kendo astronaut. I agree. And let's use that as kind of like the sort of aesthetic that we're going to apply to this police force. And it just galvanized everybody in the room. I don't think the designs that we made were any good, but watching kind of that ripple of excitement go around the sort of boardroom table that we sat around when we were taking meetings, that was like a really exciting moment. And I was like, oh, maybe I could do this, but like maybe I could do this kind of like a little bit better. So the greatest joy of this game, I think, was getting to work on the environment. None of this stuff ever really got built in the end, but oh, it's got a rude word in it. Sorry, everyone. I forgot that was in there. But this was amazing. I do remember people looking at this and being like, "Oh my God, he stuck a train on the ceiling. That's really cool." And I was like, "Isn't that the most obvious thing to do in the world?" But it did seem to make people like really, really excited. So then we worked on this game, and this game was a good lesson for me to learn that just because you like an IP as a consumer doesn't mean that it's fun to work on. When I was in high school, X-Men was the business. I'm sure some of you have watched X-Men '92. I think that's what it's called on Disney Plus. The original series that came out when I was in high school, and everybody loved the X-Men, including me. So when we signed the deal with Activision to make this game, I was like, oh my God, this is like a dream come true. And for about the first 2 weeks, it was because they were like, go ahead, our department, you decide what this game should look like. And we sat around the boardroom table, and somebody was like, well, what should we do in terms of visual direction? And I said, I've got it. The X-Men go to war. And I was like, let's just do all the X-Men designs, but let's militarize them and let's like heighten the level of kind of combat and sort of what have you in the game. And so we made all of these drawings, and like these look like crappy scans, but it's because they're photos of drawings that were like really, really huge. I drew all these on paper. That was really, really fun. And then the executives at the company got involved, and they turned the game into a gigantic turd. Um, so if you find this game on Amazon, I think you can probably buy it for 50 cents. I'm going to be brutally honest with you, it's not worth it. Somebody should pay you to play this game. You shouldn't have to pay to play it because it's really, really bad. Um, but while I was working on this game, I was promoted to lead concept artist, and I was given my own corner office, and I was given a team of 6 or 7 guys to kind of manage and sort of work with. Um, and we worked a lot on this game. Silicon Knight's most famous game is a game called Eternal Darkness, which was on the Nintendo GameCube, and we wanted to make a sequel to that. And so we reached out to Nintendo and we're like, "Hey, Nintendo, do you want to make Eternal Darkness 2?" And Nintendo said, "No, at least not with you guys." And they owned the IP, so we couldn't make Eternal Darkness 2. So we made this instead. So literally, it was Eternal Darkness 2. We just called it something else. Um, this this was when I really started to kind of like figure out like how to make work that was good. If this seems really small, it's because the painting is so long. This was a level in the game where you played as a Spanish conquistador somewhere in the Americas, I think in what would be kind of Mexico today. And even though I made this like nearly 20 years ago, I still look at this now and I'm like, holy shit, I'm kind of proud of that. That's a pretty good image. If anybody goes onto my website and takes a look at this, the astute amongst you will notice that two of the conquistadors are peeing in the river in the background. And I remember this causing like a huge kind of like fuss in the boardroom. They were like, oh, those two conquistadors, they're taking a leak in the background. And I was like, yeah, conquistadors. I don't think they were very good guys. So I think they'd probably take a leak wherever they wanted to. Um, but it was one of those moments where I was kind of like really starting to figure out sort of like what visual narrative was and how I could tell a story about characters through kind of like not like dialogue or kind of like pivotal moments in the story, but just kind of like through kind of smaller actions that were kind of happening at the other side of the frame. And in some ways, that's where I got more interested in this than kind of like the primary action that you would get in a story. Anyway, my wife and I, we had a baby. And while she was pregnant, I went in one day to work and I quit. In Canada, maternity and paternity leave is pretty generous. My wife was self-employed, so she wasn't going to take maternity leave, so I got all of it. So I got an entire year off where the Canadian government basically paid me to live. And I was like, this is great. I'm going to do that. And at the same time, I'm going to figure out how to be a freelancer. I put freelance OMG next to it on purpose because I want to just assure all of you that working as a freelance concept artist is incredibly difficult. It's not to say that it's impossible, but for those of you who are like looking towards graduation and you're like, I don't want to work at a studio, I'm going to be a freelancer. Unless you are incredibly confident and unless your work is like at a really high level, I would strongly encourage you to, if you can, work in a studio setting first, because that's really where you kind of like learn how to do this job well. Being a freelancer, particularly a freelancer with a family, it's tough. There would be months where I would put a whole bunch of money in the bank and I'd be like, yes, this was a great decision. I'm kicking ass. And then 3 months later, I didn't have any work and we'd spent all of that money and all of a sudden there was nothing in the bank. And I'd say, oh my God, I've ruined our lives. Basically, I just alternated between those two extremes and started to really figure out that it probably wasn't for me. It did have some high points. I designed all of the sneaker components for the sneaker editor in NBA 2K14. And as far as I know, they still use the same sneaker components in the versions of the game that you can buy now. And this is like over a decade later, which is really funny. The agony of having made this design is that sometimes people go into the game and commit crimes against the design like this. I very carefully designed all of these pieces to kind of like fit together in ways that kind of made sense. But when you give the consumer liberty to kind of design things themselves, invariably they make stuff that looks like this, which is, kind of an assault on the senses. Anyway, I'm working as a freelancer and I'm like, God, this is really hard. And then one day I'm driving, I don't know, to the grocery store or something, and I get a phone call and I pick it up and it's somebody at the other end of the phone who I don't recognize. And he says, hi, my name's Dennis Davenport. I'm from NBC. I'm wondering what's your availability to come and work on this TV show that we're working on called Defiance. And I was like, ha ha, yeah, okay, who is this and who put you up to this? Because this is obviously a joke. And he was like, no, this is actually a TV show. This is the address of our studio. Can you please come in tomorrow and bring your portfolio and let's talk about you working on the show if you're interested. So I was like, all right, I'm going to show up and like find out if it's for real or not. So I drive all the way across Toronto to the East End and I go to this horrible little building and I go in. And sure enough, they're making a TV show there. They're making the pilot for this show. This show lasted 3 seasons. It's really bad, but this was my first foray into live action television. And on this show, I met a guy called Dennis Davenport, who I mentioned, who had been working as an art director in Toronto for a really long time. Has anyone ever heard of the movie Police Academy? It's like it's an 80s classic. Dennis was the art director on that movie, so this will tell you how old Dennis is. So my desk is next to Dennis's, and I guess I must have done a good job on the pilot because they asked me back for season 1 when it got greenlit, and then they asked me back for season 2 and season 3. I worked with I think it was the set designer, maybe. Oh, actually, no, it was another concept artist, Rob McCallum. He also worked on Defiance. And then after Defiance wrapped and I didn't really want to work on it anymore, he had a job on this show. It's called Rain. It was on the WB network. And I got an email from Rob, and Rob was like, hey, we need another concept artist. Do you want to work on the show? It's set in like medieval France, but we film it here in Toronto. And I was like, how the hell does that work? It's a really good question because Toronto does not look like medieval France. Anyway, I went and worked on the show, great fun. And I worked with an art director here called Dean Odell. Dean Odell ended up being an art director on this show, Alias Grace for Netflix. And so after I finished working on Rain, I worked on a couple of other shows, Minority Report and some other stuff. And then I get an email from Dean and he says, oh, I'm working on this weird show. It's written by it's based on a novel by Margaret Atwood, who you should all be familiar with. She's a Canadian author. She wrote The Handmaid's Tale. She also wrote Alias Grace. And it was being adapted for the screen by the actress Sarah Polley. And the director was a woman called Mary Herron, who is the director of American Psycho. And he was like, do you want to come and work on this production? And I was like, yes, that sounds awesome. So on this show, I got to work for a production designer called Arv Graywall, who then sort of became my champion, if you will. I didn't even really want to work in television because it was really, really long hours. But Arv just kept hiring me for kind of like show after show after show. And then eventually he hired me to work on this show. Actually, this slide's a little bit gross, isn't it? But just FYI, everybody, this was my first day on the job. They were like, we want to drive a boat into the side of a whale. And I was like, that sounds disgusting. And they were like, yeah, we want you to storyboard it. And we want lots of panels of like guts going all over the place. And I was like, ew, what kind of show is this? Obviously, I'm talking about this show. So Arv was the production designer on season 2. He hired me to come in and work in-house. I worked in the studio. And then I worked remotely on seasons 3, 4, and 5. And also Generation V, which was the spin-off show on Amazon. Sadly, Arv is no longer with us. He died during the production of season 3. He had a heart attack, which was an indescribably awful day. He died on set. But Arv had an art director called Dave Best who worked on most of his productions. And even though Arv could no longer hire me to work on shows, Dave then became sort of my champion sort of in Toronto. And so I worked for Dave on maybe 10 productions. I've worked for him on like multiple TV shows, on a couple of movies. And so one of the things that I wanted to say to all of you was this idea of kind of like being a nice person. I am not a very good concept artist. I am, to use the parlance of your generation, I am very mid. I know that. There are some things I'm good at. I'm pretty good at drawing. I'm good at kind of like visual storytelling and kind of like planning a shot. I'm an absolutely lousy painter, like really bad. It's kind of miraculous that I've made it this far with sort of my limitations in terms of painting. But I am 2 things in addition to kind of being mid in terms of skill. I'm really dependable. I always show up on time and I always get stuff done. And the second thing that I do is I make a point of trying to be nice on every production that I work on. So every time I go into the office, even if it's somebody who I don't really like, I'll always make a point of, you know, hey, how's it going? How's your family? What'd you do over the weekend? Whatever it is. If it's somebody I don't like, I don't really care what they did on the weekend, but I want to kind of like exchange pleasantries and try and sort of make my relationship with everybody in production as kind of um, genial as possible. And so what happened at the beginning of my career was it was just me kind of like wandering around in the wilderness and not really knowing, frankly, my own ass from my own elbow. I didn't know how to make work. I didn't know what work was. I didn't know where to find it. I didn't know who to meet. And really, any success that I've had in my working life has been down to the generosity of other people. That job that I got on Defiance was because I had an intern at Silicon Knights who was an incredibly talented intern. He was a student at Sheridan. He interned with us for about 6 months. And then when he graduated, we hired him and he worked for me for about a year. And he was amazing. And he came into work one day and he quit. And I was like, oh, that's disappointing. But he quit because he got a job on a movie called Pacific Rim, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And when he was working on Pacific Rim, somebody from Defiance called him and said, are you available? And he said, no, I'm on Pacific Rim. And he said, but my former boss, he's freelancing right now. I think he's available. And that's why I got that call. That's how I ended up meeting Arv. And that's how I ended up working on The Boys. And as much as I take the piss out of The Boys all the time, this show has been like an amazing experience for me overall. Even though this show itself is kind of gross and like really obscene, and I can't in good consciousness sort of recommend it to all of you because there's some stuff in it which is decidedly NSFW. But it's been really good to me. It's paid me plenty of money. I've met some amazing people. I've had some really funny stories from it as well, which is kind of cool. And so I wouldn't have got there to that show if when Frank, that's the name of the artist in question, when he was working for me and when he was an intern and when he was a junior, I really tried to look after him. I didn't give him like the crap jobs and I wasn't mean to him because he was young and inexperienced. I gave him good stuff to do because he was super talented. But I made a point of trying to look after him. And then that ended up being sort of rewarded by him kind of recommending me for this job later. So this is my sort of like message to all of you right now, which is to be nice to one another, right? If there's somebody in your class who's really talented, but you don't really like them, you don't have to be their best friend, but you should be civil with them and pleasant with them because you just never know, where their career is going to go in the future. And in the same way, the people who you're going to remember as you navigate your working life post graduation, they're going to be the people who aren't necessarily the most talented, but who are the most fun to be around. Um, it's a skill that not everybody has, but I think it's a skill that people can work on. If I go back again to kind of like 1996 and I was in university, I'll be honest with you, I was kind of a dick. I was not a fun person to be around. I know this because I had roommates in university and they all hated me because I wasn't a very good guy. And it took me, yeah, a while, a few years to kind of like figure out, well, why didn't they like me? At the time, I couldn't really understand it, but looking back on it now, I'm like, oh, I totally get it. And so as I went through my career and as I worked at different places, this became kind of like the single most important thing to me was to do a good job, be dependable, but to be nice. Because nobody can really kind of do this as a job by themselves. It's impossible to do it as kind of like a singular sort of entity unless you're Craig Mullins, who I mentioned earlier. Craig can work anywhere and work on anything because he's the greatest digital painter alive. But if you're a normal person like me, you can't make it by yourself. You have to form a network and you have to make connections. There is a tendency when you're a concept artist and you're working on your portfolio to kind of like, particularly post graduation, to kind of like sit in your little room somewhere and kind of make work and sort of isolate yourself from the world. Don't do that. Reach out and network like you're doing right now with your club, with communities online. Don't stay in toxic ones where people are saying mean shit to one another. Um, Make sure that you are surrounding yourself with kind of like-minded and sort of like positive people, the type of people that you want to work with in the future. And then provided you're even halfway good at your job, good things will come out of that. Because honestly, everybody, circa even as recently as like 2005, I was a complete muppet. I had no idea. Like my art was so bad. I promised Claire that I was going to find my sketchbook from university and show it to all of you, and I really meant to. I can't find it, but what I can tell you is that the most important piece of artwork in it that I made in university that I thought was important was a very complex and dense pencil rendering of Tupac Shakur's face. that was the size of an entire page in my sketchbook. So I was a complete moron. I knew nothing about concept art. I had no skill. Couldn't even draw in perspective when I graduated from university, which is like really embarrassing to admit, but it's true. So if I can do it, so can you. So if at any time during your time here at SCAD, you sort of feel discouraged because you're looking at your peers and you're saying, ah, crap, they're a little bit better than me. It doesn't matter. They're on their kind of pace and their time and their track, and you're on yours. What you do and what they do, it doesn't actually affect one another. But what you can do is look at that person whose work is stronger than yours and say, well, how are they doing that? How did they get there? Are they working faster than me? How are they drawing things differently from me? What's their painting technique? And make sure that you ask them. Because one of the ways that we can kind of really pay somebody a compliment is by saying, what you do is amazing to me. How do you do that? Everybody wants other people to kind of be interested in their expertise or their skill because all of us, even if it's really small and quiet, we all have a little bit of an ego in our heart. And that's one of the kind of purest ways to access it is through somebody being interested in something that you can do. I think in many ways, this is how some of us end up being professors in some ways, is because it sort of stokes our egos a little bit. But I encourage you to do that while you're here, and I encourage you to do it post graduation. It's worth all of you remembering that when you graduate from SCAD, you'll have your skill set and you'll have your portfolio. That is not the best at art that you'll ever be. So when you graduate and you look at your portfolio and you say, I don't think this is good enough, there's no shame in that. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes people need additional time and additional opportunity post graduation to kind of like figure it out and to get good enough to actually compete at this other job. I hope to God for all of you, it doesn't take as long as it took me, but it took me a really long time because I was ignorant and also because I didn't ask questions. When I failed that interview at Nelvana, I should have kind of litigated that failure to myself and said, well, why did that happen? I didn't. Instead, I went home and I had a cry. I did a big boo-hoo, and I did a big boo-hoo for nearly an entire decade. Don't do that. If things aren't going your way, if let's say post graduation you haven't had any bites at the apple and you're sending out your portfolio and nothing is happening, get back in touch with Oz. Get back in touch with me. Get back in touch with Cass. Get back in touch with those professors who you whose opinion you trusted and that you thought actually had some kind of merit, and reach out to them and say, hey, I'm struggling. Can you take a look at my work? Where have I gone wrong? What should I do differently? What should I do next? Because that's how we kind of like make our way forward, is by asking for help and by leveraging our network. And so for those of you who've never been in my class, some of you are never going to take my class. It's totally fine. If you've ever been a SCAD student who wants to pursue concept art as a vocation, you can find me and add me on LinkedIn, and you can ask me questions whenever you want to. Doesn't mean I'm going to respond next day. It might take me a little bit of time to get back to you because I'm a relatively busy person. But if you've ever been my student, or if there's ever a chance that you could have been my student because you were enrolled in this institution, then I'll remain a resource for you in the future if you ever need to reach out to me. And I think that's the end of my, that's as far as I got with my slideshow. It had way less in it than I wanted it to. Certainly way less cartoons of me getting sort of progressively fatter as the years went on. I was going to do one of me with like two babies underneath my arm, and then I was going to do one with like two grown kids and like a dog and like all kinds of stuff. And then I was going to do one of me arriving in America, and I was going to be waving around a flag and a gun. No, just kidding, not the gun, the flag. You know, you guys get it. Most of you are American. All right. Sorry, that was a joke in poor taste, wasn't it? But I couldn't help myself. Does anybody? We've got a little bit of time left. See, Claire, I managed to land the plane. I came in underneath 1 hour. Does anybody have any questions? Claire, you had some questions, right?
Yes, we did. We have some from our Instagram, which have it up for like everyone else in the room to see. But we had people asking some questions about tips on maintaining network relationships. If you had a response to that, and then we have a few more. I can share my screen 1 second.
Sure. So you can all educate me. Like back in the day when I was starting, everyone who was a concept artist or everybody who wanted to be a concept artist, we all used the same website. It was called conceptart.org, and it was wonderful. It was like it was really fun. A lot of people on there were like the same age, and we were all kind of like starting out, and like none of us really knew what we were doing, but it was pretty cool. And there were a few guys on there who were Justin Sweet was on there, Marko Djurdjevic was on there, um, Jason Manley ran it, I think, and Andrew Jones, who did all the concept work on Metroid Prime for the GameCube, he was on there. So we had some like older guys who were established who could help kind of like guide us. So I mentioned this earlier, finding kind of like a network that is kind of like positive is sort of the way to go. So that could either be, obviously it's not Twitter. It could be Instagram, it could be lots of different places. But one of the things that was nice about conceptart.org, and then one of the things that I did after that was I was part of a group. What the hell were we called? We were called like we were called like Flying Monkeys or something like that. I can't remember. We actually put out a book of concept art that we were all in. No, not Flying Monkeys. We were called Gorilla Art Fair. And so it was you had to be invited to this forum. So you had to know somebody to kind of get in. But once you were in, there was just like a whole bunch of people in there that you didn't know. And that was an amazing way to kind of like meet people, get to know people, and the whole bit. So yes, leverage the internet at large, but even if you never meet people, like there's a really good concept artist called Thomas Scholes. I've never met him in my life, but we've known each other for 15 years via the internet. He's been an amazing kind of like resource for me to kind of like utilize over time. So what you want to try and do is sort of like find your tribe, even if you don't actually know them, and you want to kind of like build your sort of network from there of people who are actually kind of like serious about this as a craft and not just kind of like everybody on the internet. At what point of the journey to learning realistic concept art do you recommend photo bashing? Does it hinder your artistic growth in any way? What about kit bashing? So, if you want to work in live action development or you want to work in games, but at kind of like the realistic end of the spectrum, let's say you want to go and work for like Ubisoft, for example, all they do is photo bash, really. That's not to say that the artists there aren't amazing. They're incredible painters, but they make work out of 3D and photos. So you've got to know kind of like what the industry is that you want to go into. The opposite of that is animation. Nobody in animation photo bashes. They kit bash, but they don't photo bash because the outcome that you're expected to produce is not meant to look like a photograph. So if you show up to like an animation interview and you've got like a whole bunch of photo bashing in your portfolio, they're going to look at it and be like, what is this? And then conversely, if you show up to a realistic, um, if you try and apply to like a realistic production and it's all stylized and it's cute and it's cartoony, you're just never going to get anywhere. So what you want to try and do is identify kind of like what makes you happy. One of the most important, does it hinder your artistic growth in any way? No. Photo bashing and kit bashing, they're both skills. It's really easy to do it badly, and it's really hard to do it well. You still have to manage all the same things: color, value, composition, shape, etc., etc. You're just making it out of slightly different raw material. And even when you work on a realism production, you still have to draw. You formulate the ideas through drawing. It's really only the final images that you actually execute through photo bashing. So you're only doing it like a certain percentage of the time anyway. So yeah, in part of what everyone should be doing while they're still a student is trying these things and saying, do I like it? Photo bashing isn't for everybody. I don't particularly enjoy it. I do it out of professional necessity, but really what I like to do is draw. So if you can identify now that you love photo bashing and you love realism, start cultivating that as a skill immediately. If you find that you're not interested in that and you like to make stuff that is more stylized and more cartoony, don't do that. Focus on your ability to just draw and kind of like paint without the assistance of photographic information. Kit bashing, everybody who's listening to me talk right now, if you don't know how to use 3D, jump off this Zoom call, go and download Blender, go to YouTube and start learning how to use 3D because that is part of the landscape of contemporary visual development. So it's almost impossible to work on a gig now without it. Like season 5 of The Boys, I only worked on it for a few weeks and they'd hired a whole bunch of new people in the art department. And the reason why is because they were all really good at 3D. I'm getting there, but I still think at 3D. So they didn't really want me to do that much designs of kind of sets anymore. They just wanted me to do kind of like background illustrations that would go on like posters and like packaging and stuff that they were going to physically produce and have on the show. That's really cool work. I really enjoy doing that, but it was kind of humbling to see all of these, frankly, younger, cheaper people who could just do all the stuff that I couldn't do. So you got to learn 3D. If we aren't able to get an internship for the summer, what would you recommend doing and focusing on to further our careers? Is there any way to still make headway into the industry? Yeah, you betcha. Work on your portfolio, right? Never take like a month off and be like, oh, I'm not going to work for a month. Don't do that. Keep your hand in. The other thing to do as well is like if you've kind of like flatlined a little bit in your career and like you didn't get an internship and there aren't job opportunities coming, pick one thing that you're not good at and cultivate that as a skill. So for many of you in the room, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you don't love designing and drawing vehicles. Vehicle design is really, really hard. And that's why you don't see it in everybody's portfolio because nobody really wants to do it because it's so difficult. So if you're not good at vehicle design and you're not getting opportunities, go and learn how to get good at that and start designing vehicles that actually look like they could work. And I have a strong suspicion that if you're even remotely good at it, you'll start to see opportunities open up that just weren't there before. Functional design is so important. It's not all about glamorous, fully rendered paintings. You need to be able to design stuff that actually looks like it can do something, that looks like it can work effectively. Um, how do you utilize networking? Yeah, we already talked about that, right? Any tips if you went to a networking event and getting your stuff in front of people and following up? That's a good question. Pre-internet, when I was kind of going to stuff and networking, everybody would carry around a sketchbook, and you'd see somebody else with a sketchbook, and you'd say, "Can I see your sketchbook?" And they'd say, "Yeah, can I see yours?" And you'd switch sketchbooks, and you'd look at one another's drawings. You'd be like, "Oh, you like orcs?" And then say, "Oh yeah, you like robots." You'd be like, "Oh yeah, cool." Obviously, we don't do that anymore because we're all a little bit more evolved as a species. I still think a sketchbook is like a really viable way of kind of like introducing yourself to people. Um, if you are interested in art and somebody else makes art, they might be a 3D artist, you might be a 2D artist. They might make realistic, like sci-fi stuff, you might make adorable fantasy stuff. The one thing that you'll share in common is that you like to draw, and then at some point in your life you will have kept a sketchbook. So I've always found it's worth taking one to an interview, as long as the sketchbook's good. Don't show it to them right away, but put it on the table. Talk about your portfolio on the screen because they'll have it on screen in the room. And if one of the recruiters on the other side of the table says, "Is that sketchbook? Can I see it?" That's usually a really good sign that they are interested in your candidacy because they want to see more of your work. So to me, the sketchbook is kind of that thing that I use to kind of break down barriers between myself and people that I don't know. Do we only photograph from our own photographs or from images we purchased? How does using other people's images for practice tie into giving proper credit and licensing? That's a great question. If you're if you're photo bashing and it's not for profit, you're just making it for yourself, you can just use Google. As long as the image isn't super recognizable. If it's like an iconic photograph that everybody will instantly recognize, obviously don't use that. But if it's a more generic image, you can just use it. And the more that you kind of split images up into their constituent pieces, the less they look like the original image, and you can get away with a lot. Once you're working on a show for money and they want you to photo bash, they should be able to pay for a license to get access to like Getty Images or some other kind of rights-free image resource. And if you're a freelancer, you probably have to invest in that and pay for it yourself, because then you can just use the photographs without any fear of kind of like later sort of like difficulty. So on the boys, we use yeah, I think we use Getty. I can't remember, but when you're not making money, if you're just making it for yourself, you can use whatever. Nobody's going to sue you for that. Is it better to really focus on joining a specific community for networking or drop your work in a number of communities? It obviously is the second one, right? Dip your toe in a couple of puddles, but then try and find the ones that are kind of good and worth investing in and actually invest your time and effort into those. And if there's others where people aren't kind of communicating or they're not communicating in a way which is useful, you just phase those out over time. And so start broad and then just start to kind of like narrow as time goes along, and you start to kind of like build your own network rather than the internet at large. How important is it to narrow down stylization in the concept art portfolio, i.e. realistic versus cartoony? Well, I've kind of already answered this question, I think, in some ways. Like, it, it, you don't need to make work that looks exactly like what a potential employer is already making, but it does need to be in the ballpark. So if you're going to interview on Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, but everything in your portfolio looks like Arcane, they might look at it and say, wow, you're a hell of an artist, but you're not demonstrating that you can make the type of work that they need. So I think one of the easiest ways to think about this is think, do you like realism or stylization? And then what's the age range that you feel like you want to work in? Because those things don't really kind of like scale up and down. If you want to work in preschool development or like early age development, like let's say you want to work on Paw Patrol, just FYI, everybody, Paw Patrol makes between $1 to $3 billion a year, so Paw Patrol is kind of awesome. But if you show up to a Paw Patrol interview with like, yeah, a bunch of I don't know. If you show up to Paw Patrol with the boys, it's not going to happen. Um, I was telling somebody this story the other day. I ended up at SCAD because of a difference of 24 hours. I was offered a job 24 hours after I signed my contract with SCAD to go and be an art director on a PBS show for a studio called Pipeline. And the reason why that timing worked out that way was because the VP of development really liked me and he liked my stuff. And he was like, I want to hire you. But the president of the company looked at my portfolio, which was all like murder and blood and stuff. And he was like, this guy can't work on a PBS show. This just isn't going to work. The VP eventually talked him into it and was like, listen, I have a feeling about this guy. I think he's wired the right way. He's got a lot of skill. He says the right things in an interview. I think we should hire him. So he called me to offer me the job, but it was 24 hours too late. I'd signed a contract to move here and work for SCAD. So um, if I'd had more kind of like cute and friendly stuff in my portfolio, I wouldn't be here now. I'd probably still be working there. The show that I would have been art director on, it won 5 Emmys, I think. So maybe I would have dragged it down in terms of like aggregate quality, and maybe it wouldn't have won any Emmys. But um, I do look at that sometimes, and I'm like, oh crap, it would have been nice to kind of like be in on that. But this is the way things go. So the advice that I always give to people is fill your portfolio with the stuff that you enjoy making, because that is going to directly dictate the jobs that you're going to realistically vie for. If you're a genius and you can kind of make work that fulfills every possible kind of like taste and interest, then awesome. You just make this like super diverse portfolio and you can work wherever you want. But if you do fill your portfolio full of like guns and blood, you're not going to work on a preschool show and vice versa, right? You just have to think strategically about what it is that you want to do. Um, Yash asked a question as well. Can I ask, how do you approach someone you don't know at all and build a connection without coming off like you're advertising? Great question. Don't ask for a job. Don't advertise. Just try and make a human connection, and just meet the person and be like, hey, good to meet you. You're an artist? Oh, that's awesome. What kind of art do you make? Ask them questions about themselves. Don't try and show them. If they ask to see your work or they ask what you do, you can tell them and you can show them, but don't try and push it on them. Just try and make a connection, try and have a good kind of experience, a good moment, a little bit of friendly banter or conversation, and just say, hey, you're involved in art, what have you? Would it be okay if I add you on LinkedIn? And if they say yes, then you add them on LinkedIn. And like a week or two later, not the same day because you don't want to seem desperate, but a week later or so, just ping them a short message on LinkedIn and be like, hey, it was great to meet you. I really enjoyed our conversation. I just wanted to say hi. Now that we're connected on LinkedIn, that's really cool. It was great to meet you. You still don't say, hey, can you give me a job? You just try to build that connection. You try to make that human connection before you ask for stuff. So this dovetails into what I was saying before about kind of like, this is how you navigate this as a career. It's just by being nice, right? Don't ask somebody for something if you don't know them. You have to earn their respect and their trust. And the way that you do that is by treating them nicely and being friendly. And don't talk about work or kind of an opportunity that you're hoping for. Ask them about them. Who are they as a person? What do they like to do? What have they done? Try to leverage kind of like their expertise and their experience and what they're interested in. Get them talking about that to you, and you'll be amazed what people come out with. You just have to make the focus then, and then if they start talking, that's great. Eventually, you're going to have your opportunity where that conversation is going to flip the other way, and if unless they're a complete dick, they're going to say, well, "What about you?" And then that's when you can say, "Well, I really want to be a concept artist. And they just, hopefully, unless they're a complete jerk, they'll say, interesting. Can I see your work? And then you send them your link or whatever it is. And then they look at it and you kind of go from there. So I think that's the best advice is to not try to make anything happen the first time that you meet somebody, other than to try to have a good experience where you make a kind of like friendly, kind of like just really high level, kind of normal connection.
Does anyone here have a question for Professor Standing? No?
No, just thank you for coming and talking to us.
I already talked way too much, so I don't blame you for not having any questions. You probably don't want to go home or go and have like a stiff drink or something. Hey, thank you everybody for listening to me. I really appreciate it. Hopefully, any of what I said was useful or even remotely entertaining. Those of you who have not met before, you know who I am. You know my name. You can find my contact information via my SCAD. You can shoot me an email and be like, "Hey, I came to your concept art club presentation. I'd like to talk to you some more about this one thing that you said or whatever." And let's us start a conversation, and then I can become a part of your professional network. So anybody who's interested, you reach out to me anytime. Okay. All right, Claire, am I excused now? Can I go?
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good
Thank
weekend.
you, Prof.
Good luck with the
Thank
wedding
you.
next week, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Stay warm.
I don't know.
Oh my God, it's not recorded.